Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week I am joined by Sabina Nawaz. Sabina is a returning guest, so I'm really excited to see what she's been up to recently. Sabina is the CEO of her own consulting firm, previous senior human resources at Microsoft, but still excites me actually that you know Bill Gates. Sabina, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Of course, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to come back again. I coach CEOs across the globe one-on-one, do leadership training, keynote speeches, and most recently, I'm an author of the upcoming book, You're the Boss, Become the Manager You Want to Be and Others Need. It is available online now for pre-orders, and it is going to be released by Simon & Schuster on March 4th.
Okay, so the last time that we spoke, we actually touched on, we spoke a lot about this book, the up-and-coming book that you were going to be writing. So it's actually finished, so congratulations on that. But did you change it a lot about what you wrote during your time to when we last spoke?
The answer is yes and no, as in the essence of the book has remained the same right from the beginning. In fact, I thought about writing this probably 10 years ago to now. It's been a long journey, and from thinking, wondering, to actually doing. The essence of the book is based on 12,000 pages of verbatim data. And that data comes from me interviewing colleagues, coworkers, direct reports of the people I coach to get feedback on them. I write down everything people say in terms of giving feedback about their bosses or their peers. And then I compile that to look at all the themes that come from that to understand what is it that people want most in their managers and what is it that bugs people the most in their managers. And therefore, how should managers manage that? How should they lead organizations and teams in a way that works well for those who work for them, but also produces better and everlasting business results?
I mean, that sounds amazing, but what is the one thing that people look for in their managers then?
Boiling it down to one thing is tough. I think that one of the things people really look for is a manager who gets them, who sees them, who understands who they are and how they work and the effort they're putting in, the impact that they're having. So somebody who sees and acknowledges what people do.
Okay, but is that not hard? Because I'm a manager myself, and I try to be very understanding and to support all my colleagues as well. But it can be hard to get everybody, I would have thought.
For sure, it's really hard. It's also hard to scale that up when it's one thing when you're managing a team of, say, 4 or 5 people, but what if now you're managing managers who each manage 4 or 5 people and so on and so forth. So the higher you go, the harder it becomes. And how do you scale that level of seeing people, acknowledging them, having empathy for their work, having appreciation, in turn motivating them to do their best work? And that's one of the things I talk a lot about in the book as to how do you go about doing that the higher up you go.
Okay, but how do you go about doing that then? Because that would be very challenging, I would have thought.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, there's 2 dimensions that I talk about in the book. One is pressure and the other is power. That rather than power corrupting us, pressure corrupts us. In other words, the greater the pressure we are under, the more we have a choice on how we show up and how we act. And all of us, myself included, have done things that we're not proud of when we're under pressure. We might do some things very differently when we're not under as much pressure. So one of the things to think about when you're managing people is what are the pressures you are under and how are you responding to that? Pressure, as somebody wise once recently told me, reveals character. And which side of your character are you going to reveal? Are you even conscious of making that choice when you're under pressure? Power, on the other hand, then blinds you to the impact that your pressure-ridden behaviors are having on other people. So people don't tell you if it's having a negative effect. People don't give you corrective feedback. People don't share with you the bad news because they know what's going to happen when it raises more pressure for you and you're going to act out. So the higher you are up you go, the less people will tell you the truth and the more pressure you're going to be under. So you've got this dangerous cocktail of the two that's going to keep you away from it. So how do you do this? What do you do? Well, power creates this gap between us and the people who report up to us. And the higher you go again, the bigger the gap is in danger of becoming, because people are more and more in awe of you or afraid of you. They know you have hold a big sway over their destinies. And so I've identified a few power gaps and a few pressure pitfalls, if you will, and one of the things to work on, one of the strategies to deploy would be how do you reduce those power gaps? What can you do to create more of a bridge versus a distance? And I can speak to some specific ideas there in a moment. And then what do you do to mitigate the effect of those pressure pitfalls? How do you manage those pressures? Look, as you're managing, and I'm sure you know this, Michelle, that you can never be pressure free. In today's world, who can be pressure free? And I'm not just talking about managers, I'm talking about anybody. So when we're not pressure free, how do we pressure proof ourselves? What are some things we can do to proactively recognize, first of all, to diagnose and recognize that we're facing those pressures? And then second, have a plan ahead of time, not in the heat of pressure, that helps us with mitigating the corrosive effects of that pressure.
Okay, but then everybody handles pressure differently. So, is there a correct way to handle pressure? Because I think everybody's under pressure, no matter what level you are. I mean, everybody thinks that their own pressure is unique and as bad as maybe the CEO's when you're maybe just a junior engineer, but we all feel it.
Great question. So one of the things to understand is what is your particular flavor of pressure? What are the things that cause you pressure? Because exactly right, Michelle, we all face pressure. In fact, sometimes managers are fond of saying we're all in the same boat. And again, somebody wise told me, we're not all in the same boat. We're all in the same storm in different boats. So whether you're in an ocean liner or in a dinghy or in a canoe or a kayak or a rowboat or a powerboat, you're going to have different experiences and you're going to respond to things differently. So for one person, pressure might mean all the stuff they've taken on themselves because it's harder for them to say no, or even saying no causes pressure. For someone else, it might mean that pressure for them is when they have to stand up in front of large audiences. They're fine one-on-one, they're fine in smaller groups of 4 and 5, but the minute they have to speak to 20 people or 2,000 people, whatever the number, it causes a lot of pressure. So absolutely different people. So not only do people have different pressures, you want to recognize what kind of pressure is actually pressure for you. Because it might be a walk in the park for somebody else, the very same thing that's pressure for you. So diagnosis is, I want to say, 2/3 of the battle. To really recognize what that is before I apply any of the many tools and tactics that I have in the book.
Okay, that was interesting, especially because I was going to ask you a question. Do you think that a lot of CEOs think that their pressure makes them feel like they're in a dinghy by themselves?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the higher up we go, the more isolated we feel. Some of it is our own doing because we act out in ways which creates fear and shock and awe in people who don't want to then approach us, but also just the position alone. You replace person A with person B, but if they're in a senior position, by definition, it's harder and harder for others to be in that same dinghy with you. One, it's a unique role. Two, nobody else fully understands the degree of pressure, challenges, vantage point that you have. I mean, that's one of the reasons people hire me as a coach, is because they say, I know you get it. You know what this is like. And most of the people that I'm with, I cannot be as open because everybody has an agenda. Everybody needs something from me.
Do you really think that a CEO can't be as open? Because the CEO is maybe is the highest level of a company that you can go. Maybe it would be hard to think that people he couldn't be open to discuss any issues he was having with his colleagues in case they used it against him. That's
Exactly.
yeah, that's surprising actually, even at that level.
Yeah, let me make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. Are you saying it would be difficult to be open? Or are you saying something else?
I think it would be difficult to be open, but then it's also
Yes.
surprising that they can't be open in fear that someone might use that information for something else.
Yeah, I think both things are true. That it's hard for others to understand and get, and everybody's going to see it from their angle. Because the higher up you go, your decisions impact a large number of people in a large number of ways. It makes it an outsized impact. It's like you have a megaphone strapped to your mouth. So you say something like this, and it comes across like that. It's really outsized because people make sometimes mountains out of molehills, or certainly they will personalize it. Imagine if you got, Michelle, a message from your manager on a Sunday saying, come see me on Monday. What is your reaction going to be?
I think I would be worried all until I saw him actually.
Right? There
Yeah.
goes your weekend because you're like, oh my gosh. And it could be something completely harmless from their side, completely harmless. I'm not anybody's boss anymore. I used to be in the corporate world, but even without being a boss, I often, if I'm asking for something out of the ordinary, I often say, all good news. Can we meet on Monday? Just to reassure people and not have them spend energy on something that's just wasted energy. So I think it's back to whoever your boss is, Michelle, you would have that feeling, you would have that knot in your stomach. It would impact your weekend. It's not because of the particular person who happens to be your boss, who could be overflowing with the milk of human kindness, and I'm sure they are, but it could be, it is because they are your boss.
Okay. Okay. That is interesting though. I'm going to ask you, what do we not want from our bosses then?
What do we not want?
Yeah, what do we not want from our bosses?
Mm. Well, Michelle, the number one complaint that I heard in all those 12,000 pages of data is that my boss has a hard impact on other people. And by hard impact, they're short. They come across grouchy. They sometimes even do a lot more than just grouchy. They yell and scream. They fail to acknowledge people. So things that have a hard impact on the other person. If we follow the first do no harm, that would be the very first thing that bosses should not do. The second piece and the second most common theme that came across in analyzing all of this data is around communication. And by communication, it follows many, many different areas, but this sort of lack of clarity, assuming that I know better than everyone else. And so therefore I'm going to come and just tell you things like they are. Again, not providing enough positive versus corrective, not clarifying. Remember, if I do have that megaphone strapped to my mouth, I need to clarify how important certain things are. Otherwise, my throwaway comments become major work efforts for people. And 6 months later, I'm wondering, what the heck are they doing? Why haven't they done the thing I wanted them to do? Why are they spending time on this busy work? Well, the busy work actually came out of your mouth because you offhand happened to say, oh, I like the color green. And now all the walls are getting painted green, so to speak, metaphorically.
Okay, so how does managers bridge the gap between what their employees want and what their employees don't?
One piece is to ask. And the reason I was hesitating before answering this, Michelle, is that asking may or may not yield you the truth. I often tell people the minute you become a manager, you have stopped receiving the full truth. People are going to embellish, people are going to burnish, people are going to hide certain things. People are going to say the opposite of what they mean. Oh, yeah, no, you gave a great all hands, when actually they're rolling their eyes at whatever you presented. So you can ask. I think it's ask and be consistent. If you keep asking in a consistent fashion, ultimately people will recognize you're really there to grow and learn, and that there are no consequences that they can see of them being honest and open. So that would be the first thing I would suggest.
Okay, but then even if you're going to ask, even if your boss is going to ask even if yeah, I was going to. We're going to start again. 3, 2, 1. We're going to start again. So even if you were going to ask your employees whether you were a good boss, although no bosses I would think would do that, they're not going to tell you the truth. They're just going to gloss over it. Yeah, you're great.
Yeah, and so there's various ways of asking. For example, if you just simply say, how did I do in that meeting? They're going to go, you did great, boss. And that's it. And that's not really valuable. It gives you some reassurance. Maybe your weekend goes well with that reassurance, but you're not getting anything specific. Instead, if you said, what's one thing I did that went well in that meeting? And what's one thing, if I did more of or less of, you think the meeting could have gone even better? Now you're more likely to get something that's more valuable. So making your questions specific. The quality of your question is directly proportional to the quality of the answer you receive. So if you think you're getting crappy answers, check the quality of the questions you're asking. That would be one way to ask, where you're making it very specific and you're ring fencing the response by one thing that I did more of or less of. Another way to do it is to externalize the ask. So instead of saying, hey, Michelle, what feedback do you have for me? You might say, if Michelle, you know a lot of people in this organization, what would you say people who are supporters of me, fans of me, say about me? What are some ways in which they describe this particular aspect of my working? And then what would you say people who are not such big fans of mine say? So now it doesn't become about you and me, Michelle. It doesn't become an us versus them here. You're freed up to channel other voices, which might very well just be your own voice. A third way to ask is to ask for different kinds of perspectives on framing certain challenges. So this is not all just about me and feedback for me. It's more importantly about the business, the opportunities, the challenges that we're working on. If I come in and say, we're going to work on X, and this is exactly what the problem is with X that we're going to go solve, nobody else is going to look any further. It quashes creativity. And worse, it potentially leads to a great solution on a completely wrong problem. So going back to diagnosis, which is our friend in a number of different ways, you could say, let's spend 10 minutes just figuring out multiple different ways to frame this challenge. What are your thoughts around what is the actual issue over here? And see what people come up with, because they might broaden the diagnosis to place where you choose a whole different solution than what you thought you were going to choose.
Okay, even if putting the questions like that, it still could be hard for anybody to answer, because you're never really going to tell your boss the whole truth. Are you supposed to just read between the lines then of what someone's telling you, or?
There was a provost at a prominent university in the northeast of the US, and he came to speak to the participants in a workshop that I was running for the week. One of the things he said he does is triangulate. In other words, he asks 3 people the same question, their view about a certain thing. And then he tries to, this guy was an engineer by training, he tries to then reconcile the 3 different versions to get at the best of each perspective, or the most valuable thing from each perspective. Yeah, you will never get the full truth. And I don't think that's just with bosses, with anyone we're in relationship with. How many people are there in our lives where we tell them exactly the way things are all the time? Not so much.
No, probably not. Which is a sad realization, actually.
Well, it's a sad realization, or it might be a realization that should give us a lot of empathy, that we are all human and we deeply, deeply care. We care about that relationship. And in our head, the narrative is that if we are direct, that relationship will get impacted. Now, in some cases, it will, because not everybody is open to that kind of feedback. And in some other cases, it actually will strengthen the relationship.
Okay. I agree. I do agree with that, actually. So how do you know if you are a good boss then?
Mm-hmm. At the very end of my book, I have a, a diagnostic tool where I say 360 yourself. 360s are these interviews where people get feedback from their coworkers. Well, not everybody has the luxury to hire an executive coach and do a 360 interview. So I have these questions based on the most common power gaps and pressure pitfalls that you can do for yourself. Do an assessment. See what your answers are. See what your score is. Look at the things that score low, and then make a decision on addressing those particular pieces.
Okay, so what typical questions should you ask yourself then?
Well, it depends on, back to diagnosis, it depends on what kind of challenges you have. So let's say that, I'm just glancing really quickly here. Yeah. So one of the pressure pitfalls I call the sole provider trap, which is where you think that you have to do it all and you have to provide all the answers. And it can come wrapped in noble stories like, my team is really busy. I'm just trying to be helpful. But what ends up happening is that everyone then you become the bottleneck. Everybody's needy from you, and they don't know how to do these things on their own. So for example, for the sole provider trap, the questions, a few questions here. Your team is highly dependent on you for answers and input. You take on others' work and have noble stories about why you do so. Your plate is overloaded, and no one offers ideas or solutions other than you. I cannot tell you the number of people I coach who complain that, well, if I didn't bring ideas up, if I didn't suggest agenda items, even for the meeting, it would be crickets. No one else does it. Well, have you considered that the reason no one else does it is because you abhor a vacuum and you jump in and fill that up right away? So often I tell people, be the third person to speak. Be the third person to speak. And allow for some discomfort as the molecules shift in that silence. Ultimately, someone else will start participating.
Okay. Okay, because I've been in a couple of meetings like that probably many years ago, where I was the meeting wasn't chaired by me, but it was started by a couple other people, and then it was big silence. So then I would take over. So that's not a bad thing then.
For sure. The thing to think about is it the same person always taking over, or are there multiple people? Because the idea is to create ownership across the team. See, most teams operate in this hub and spoke model, where the manager is the hub and each spoke gets animated and activated only when their team, their department, their report is being presented. The rest of the time, they're checked out on their phones. So that's a group, not a team. A team is where everybody is interconnected. It's not a hub and spoke. We are mutually accountable to each other. We truly believe that our success is not going to happen unless everybody else is successful. To do that, you want multiple people jumping in, filling in that silence.
Yeah, I think so too, actually. I do actually think so too. But then should your boss, if your team is maybe has a lot of overwork and they're quite busy, is is it the manager's duty to take on some of their workload as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I think you will hear me say this over and over again. It goes back to diagnosis. Should the manager take on the work? Is the work worthy of taking on? Let's start there. Maybe the team is clinging on to things that they don't need to do. Or maybe you've told them to do things that they don't really need to do, that are not as high a priority. So I would look at what is on the whole portfolio of work first. Of course, the managers should roll up their sleeves and help out where necessary. But helping out doesn't always mean rolling up their sleeves and doing the job hands-on. It might mean getting more resources, getting more clarity. There was a study done at Harvard about what motivates people the most by Teresa Amabile. And her finding was that the single biggest thing that motivates employees is when managers remove barriers. So, yes, you should jump in and do the work, but question what is the work you need to do? What is the work you're uniquely qualified to do? And one of those pieces of work is to remove barriers.
That actually resonates quite well because I did interview one of my previous bosses maybe quite recently, and he says the best managers delegate to the point where they're not needed, but they're always in the background to give guidance and a helping hand if his team and colleagues needed it. Is that true?
Yes. However, the number one mistake people make when delegating is they take their hand off the steering wheel a little too fast. When we teach kids, for example, how to ride a bicycle, we don't do that on the highway. We do it on a tricycle with training, and then with training wheels on a bicycle, and so on and so forth. We don't do that when we delegate. We just go, oh, let me empower you. And what happens there? The person is not ready to take a bicycle onto the freeway, nor should anyone be taking it onto the highway. And they crash. And when they crash, the manager swoops in and does the work, and it creates frustration and a lack of trust on both directions. So that taking your hand away from the steering wheel is not an on-off switch. It is a dial. And that's one of the tools I share is a delegation dial based on the level of skill, knowledge, experience that your direct report has. You slowly, slowly, slowly turn that dial to the degree that they are able to handle until ultimately you can simply be a safety net.
Okay, but how do you know when it's time to take your hand off the steering wheel?
Mhm, mhm. Well, you've got 4 steps in the delegation dial before that 5th step of taking your hand off the steering wheel. So you see successively how people are doing, the kinds of questions they're asking. One of the step right before that safety net is coaching, where you're asking them, How did you think about this problem? So what you want to do is start to think about not only can they execute, but can they think about this independently? How did you think about this? What other options were there? What made you choose this one? What have you learned from it? I would ask those kinds of questions to assess whether they're ready for that safety net.
Mm-hmm. And how do you assess whether they're ready whether they're ready to take away the safety net?
Based on the quality of the answers they provide on the coaching questions. They
Okay.
might come up with ideas for, oh yeah, I looked at these 5 different things, and they give you a thorough analysis of why this is the thing they chose out of those 5. That's a very different kind of answer than someone who says, oh, I didn't really think to consider other alternatives. I just jumped in and did what you asked me to do. Well, then maybe they're not quite ready to be independent.
No, I think so too, actually. I really liked what you were saying, but how do you go about getting your colleagues to take ownership of their own work and to make decisions for themselves?
With a lot of guidance and coaching at first. Look, most people will want to do that. They'll want to do that as long as you make a connection to the payoff. If the payoff is you don't get to take as long a vacation anymore, then obviously no one's going to want to do that. They're going to go, I'll sit and watch you do it. Why should I take it on? But if, for example, you understand what that person's career aspirations are, and taking on this ownership is going to really help them set them on that path towards their career goals, they're going to be way more motivated.
Okay, that is interesting. I do like that answer. What is the one takeaway aspect of your book that you think is very valuable?
The one takeaway aspect of my book that I think is valuable to anybody, whether they're a boss or not, in order to be a boss of themselves, to be a boss of yourself, recognize that pressure can corrupt your actions in a way that backfires toward the very goals you're trying to achieve.
I think that's a profound statement, actually. To be the boss of your own self, that is even difficult in itself, actually.
It is so important. I think that's job number 1, managing ourselves. It should be written into all of our job descriptions. The collateral damage when we walk around unmanaged and weaving to the whims of the pressure pitfalls that show up that day in the world, in our environment, at work, through a colleague's interaction, through our own doing, then we just those are untended, unmindful, and they cause a huge hit to our emotions, to our morale, to our productivity.
I think
Where
so
do we want
too.
to put our focus? Do we want to put our focus on untended reactions, or do we want to put our focus on really hitting our goals the way we're supposed to?
Yeah, but I think a lot of people struggle at hitting their goals as well, especially the younger graduates as well when they're starting their first job. What advice would you give them actually when starting out how to manage themselves?
Yeah, I think I want to respond to your goal point of whether or not your goal is clear. Goal does not have to be in block capital letters. It doesn't even have to start with a capital G. It could be a micro goal. What is your goal today? What is your goal in this hour? How do you want to feel at the end of the day today? Often when you do meditation or yoga, they ask you to set some sort of a goal like that. Maybe it's just something that small. And in terms of advice of how to manage pressure when you're just starting out, it's about give yourself double the credit you're giving yourself. Most people just starting out think, I don't have enough experience. I don't know what I'm going to contribute. I have to talk to this very senior person. What am I going to do in return? They're actually excited to talk with you because your perspective, your fresh perspective is incredibly valuable. You know a lot of answers that if you just gave yourself permission to say you do, it would unlock this font of knowledge that you already have. It doesn't mean you're not going to learn more. It doesn't mean you're not going to stretch more. It doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of things you don't know. But it's usually we focus in this sort of scarcity mindset way of let me focus on what I suck at or what I don't know, versus an abundance mindset way of maybe the things I am giving myself credit for can be increased by 50%.
Okay. But I think it's just taking the leap of faith for a young graduate to speak to their managers and to give them their advice and input.
And you don't want to jump in right away to advice and input. Back to asking, going curious, ask questions. What keeps them up at night? What's most important to them? What would be most helpful for them from someone who's just starting out? Gather that data like any good research project. And based on that, come back with your thoughts.
Okay. That is an interesting concept as well. So, I have no other questions. Do you want me to ask you any questions actually before we finish up? Is there anything you wanted to discuss or anything else?
Michelle, I love this about you. You've been so thorough in your questions. I
can't think of anything else actually. And I would talk to you. Yes, I would talk to you all night actually, but I can't think of anything else. So that's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Sabina for your time. I am really going to be really excited to be ordering your book and reading it as well. Your book is out in the 4th of March and it's called You're the Boss. And of course, that's an important message for anybody. I would like to thank you for your time, and that's all the questions I have, and see you next week.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you so much. It was a joy to see you again and be on your podcast. I really appreciate it.
That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening and see you next week.